fun, and the second went by because everyone was just
Yeah,
watching.
yeah, that's gonna be today.
Okay,
I call it the Easter Island effect.
Yes.
They all sit there like a stone statue.
okay. All right, so this week we're gonna do pedagogical principles, theory, and practice. So as always, there's the deal, check in, little presentation, activity, talk with the calendar, go over anything else with that. Okay. Oh, let me learn how to use my mouse. So the check-in for this week, we're in week 7. So what is your biggest challenge? Singular challenge for this week. And then critical thinking, what has been one, again, we're doing the relating thing. What's the biggest thing on your mind? And critical thinking, which is what has been one topic discussed in this series that impacted your experience in the classroom and how has it impacted your learning?
My biggest challenge is time.
Hmm.
Fitting everything else in there and my having students actually understand. I explained what office hours are for. And I actually had one student accept it. So we're going to be working on office hours tomorrow. So that's the teaching aspect where actually they're coming in looking for help.
Yeah.
Good.
Right.
It's taken 7 weeks.
Well, again, it's mid-semester.
Yes.
Say midterms, running them, preparing them, all that.
Okay.
And then impactful discussion, they'd say the accessibility stuff and knowing about all those options for translating and stuff, because I have one, as a student with a language barrier, and that's been a huge help for him.
Oh, good.
And
Very
I
good.
work with him a lot. He always we're always making appointments and to try and keep him caught up, and so that's made a big difference
You
for
said
him.
Would that be David?
No, Tom.
Okay. Because I actually have one gentleman that he's having extreme difficulty in math. And I sent him over to the STEM center. And he said, we got all this help, but you got to ask for it.
Yep.
You got to walk over there and get it. It doesn't come to you. And it took me 2 weeks to let him know, you got to go over there.
Yeah.
So we'll see where he is. This coming
Alex?
couple of days, I'll run into him.
Alex, Mercy.
Do you know what language he's translating into?
No, off the top of my head, I do not. How about
For me, it's Vietnamese.
Yeah, I'm just curious because I've heard mixed feedback in terms of which languages work better and which, and some of the feedback has been that Eastern languages are trickier because the grammar structure is different.
Yeah,
But
it's not perfect, but
The
when he can
concept is there.
yeah, when he can cross-reference it to the English version,
Yes.
it helps him to understand it when he gets stuck.
Mhm.
that's
It's not
perfect.
but he does cross-reference it with the English version when he gets confused on something.
Yeah.
That's so great to hear. I'm really
Yeah,
glad
and
that,
then-
that
yeah,
that's
so
working.
I'm assuming you have him in metrology, but in SolidWorks, he uses his phone in class. Like he translates and he asks me questions and he takes notes and then he translates it and then he writes it down. So
Good.
because it's based off the book and it's not really like documents that I can put on Blackboard, he's still, he's able to do that in class. So he has been doing great though. He's good. Yeah. Well, for me, biggest challenge this week is definitely midterms because I'm going to a conference this weekend in the middle of midterms. So I'm trying not to freak out a little bit, but at the same time, have everything ready before I leave tomorrow. While having class, definitely.
Yeah.
And I can echo both words of Steve and Alex when it comes to Blackboard and learning, like all the resources that we have and trying to make sure that everything is accessible. And same thing with, that Alex mentioned with that student and, other students, just learning how to make everything more accessible and just kind of like walking them through it. It has been very helpful, definitely.
Good.
So today's topic, as I said, was going to be pedagogical principles, theories, and practice. And so the one thing that we're going to talk about is some basic what I wanted to do is, we only have 45 minutes and probably less of that right now, is just to give you an overview of common theories that you might hear about and give a primer. And, you know, on the way here, I was having the conversation with Mary about how, you know, I have, because of my degrees, I've had to take I've had to take 6 classes on pedagogy and learning theory. And there's not really much you can do in 30 minutes other than kind of have a brief overview. But just to kind of expose you to the topics, to think about it, what you might already know, what you don't know, what is also might be frameworks in your own profession that are based on these kind of theories that, you know, you might not be aware of, or if there's frameworks in your own practices. Sometimes we come into these sessions and someone is a fervent person who follows a particular pedagogy or theory. So first thing that I'm going to do is just kind of talk really, really briefly about learning theories in general. Now, you'll hear phrases like learning theories, pedagogy, andragogy, and also I'm going to introduce what are called instructional design theories. What all of these are kind of subsects of each of just general theories that we use in the classroom or in learning areas. So I would tell people that my early career was a lot of non-traditional education. I was in a lot of public nonprofit community work, and we still used these types of theories when you kind of engage with groups. Learning theories historically have been kind of the predominant landscape in education since probably the late 1800s. Most of the early work on learning theories came in the 1920s, 1930s, with a very large kind of explosion in the late 50s, 60s, 70s, and today. A lot of the early principles often also backed, one thing I will say about learning theories, they're also usually affected by the culture, period, and time that they were developed in. So you'll see that, I always say that the window of time where the Model T and Ford and kind of this assembly line concept, a lot of the pedagogical principles or things like that actually mimicked a lot about efficiency, structure, frameworks. Whereas when we get more into the later half of the century, they were a lot more about relationships, bringing people together, have more of a social construct to them. And that I think mirrored, especially in the United States, that mirrored a little bit of the culture. Also that a lot of these theorists come from the United States. Also, the caveat is that if you look at a picture of them, the predominant theories of the time are also middle-aged white men. So not always a lot of diversity in the early theories. So one of the initial kind of learning theories was behaviorism. And my best way to talk about behaviorism is really to say we are very familiar with it if you think about Pavlov. And you think about that call and response. And that basically is that you have every kind of action has a reaction. So when you're teaching, what you're looking to do is to provide instruction and then elicit a response back. So kind of in the basic, very quick overview of that. Behaviorism is also very teacher-centered. You'll see a lot of, and on the screen, you'll see there's a lot of overlap with some of these theories, but for the most part, behaviorism really was about the faculty member or the teacher was in the front of the classroom and the class participated. And so it was very much you had knowledge that you are providing over. Now, some people have taken now behaviorism in these later decades and kind of just made it more about when do you need to do kind of drill and skill or practice with positive reinforcement? When is repetition kind of the best parts of behaviorism in that? The other common theory is cognitivity. I can never say that word. So cognitism. And this one is going to be that is the teacher is the subject matter expert, and that you're coming in with this kind of individualized instruction, and a lot of it is based on assessment. And you're going to be teaching, kind of looking to teach in stages around the interactions you have with your students. And there's a little bit more personalized nature to this. I would say that this is kind of the blend, there's a blend of this to the behaviorism and what we call now, what I would say the predominant theory has been constructivism. This one even has divided off into what we call social constructivism. But the basic premise of constructivism is learning by gathering previously learned knowledge. We learn by our experience. We learn by the exposure that we have, and then we incorporate that into our learning. And so when you see learning by doing, this is where education starts talking about bringing the student into the situation. And we often will talk about, you know, the sage on the stage, the guide on the side. This is where the teacher becomes more of a facilitator of knowledge in the room and trying to get students to come to a place where they're taking ownership of their learning. And there's a lot more hands-on kind of making sure that you're kind of progressing through that. I would say that these kind of three have kind of like been the focus for probably the last 100 or so years, with offshoots, of course, of all of these. Mary or Marisha, any?
I would agree with this. And you might bounce around between these different. Definitely.
Yeah, that all sounds good.
Okay. So that's basically kind of learning theories. And so what I tell people is those are kind of the frameworks. Those are the things that have affected how actual specific pedagogical principles or theories come into play. This next one is going to be, I gotta make sure my mouse is there. The next one, I always like to say this is one of Mary's favorites, is actually Bloom's taxonomy. And I thought this sentence that I found on a website was really a great explanation of how Bloom's came to be. The taxonomy of educational objectives was supposed to help teachers speak the same language and thus facilitate an exchange of information about their curricular developments and evaluation devices. So if you look, 1956, we're moving from a very structured behaviorism to now moving more towards cognitivism and constructivism, where we're wanting to actually have a framework in which we can all have common language. Now, from 1956, and whenever I said that some people, there are offshoots of theories, many people have come up with a revised version of most of these kind of theories. And Bloom's is no different, because I'm sure that this was one that was done by one of Bloom's prodigies, where language was changing, because if you notice, we now go from knowledge to remember, comprehension to understand, application to apply. So now we've got we've turned from words to kind of more verb action oriented terminology, but also that, and I would say that it's really interesting that understand, because I know Mary has things about the word understand, but there's a huge debate about, can people really measure understanding? Whereas one camp says you can and one camp says you can't. And so a lot of times these things are really can be debated. But what this does help you to do is, say you're developing curriculum and you want to get students from that center of no knowledge, not aware of the topic, to moving to a place where they not only know it, they can incorporate it, apply it, then take that application and analyze why it worked or not, be able to then evaluate that whole process and themselves be able to create later on. And I would say that this is probably really important in your processes, because I'm sure that there's a point where there's only so much of, it's not just about being in front of the machine. It's about them kind of incorporating all that learned knowledge into being able to pivot and use the information that they have to then make decisions on the fly, to make adjustments, to also then step back and look at their process.
And look at the process in the bigger whole.
Initial thoughts about this particular learning theory?
It's also why you write your course objectives or your program objectives. And it's used there to move things in a direction.
A lot of times, you'll see this frequently, and I actually end up looking these up a lot, is there'll be terminology that's related to each of these. So what kind of action verbs come with remembering? What kind of action verbs come with understanding? When I create outcomes, I can always sit there and say, at the end of my semester, look at my outcomes and say, are my students able to apply? And did they meet these requirements? Are my students able to evaluate? So it allows me, regardless of, and I even say this, regardless of anybody giving you an evaluation of your work, you evaluate your own work. You look at what your students are doing, and you can say, based on my outcomes that I created for this class, I can earnestly say my students can do this skill. And you have examples, activities, that kind of thing as well.
And I would say in the instance, an example of your Vietnamese student, they're down there on remembering, understanding, and applying quite a lot in order to get that translation figured out before they can start applying and analyzing. So it's going to take them a little more time,
Yeah.
but they will get there.
And I think also that you can create classes where you're attempting to do this with the whole class, but that there is this factor of that students are exactly what Mary's saying, at their own place in that. The other thing is, when we're introducing these concepts to you, is that for some people, they really hold true to a particular theory. Like if this is new to you, for some people, this really gives them a concrete sense of how they're going to teach or move forward. I would say, as a practitioner, I have learned to take several theories and multiple strategies in how I develop content. So, and Bloom's is probably one of the most popular, probably most, I would say it's actually most frequently used in classrooms. People talk about it a lot. It's again, exactly what it was supposed to do, was to have a framework for exchange of conversation.
And you could almost take the taxonomy out and use it as a framework in relationship to the other theories.
Okay, any other things? Marisha, you good? Okay. All right, the next one, and I'm just really gonna, again, go brief over so we can have a little bit of conversation. Adult learning theories, which is androgy. So the reason I wanted to bring this up is the researcher Knowles, he, I want to say this was late 50s, early 60s. The whole premise was to move away from using theory only to talk about students as children learning, and to bring in a whole new subsect of adult learning theories. And so this is actually one of the kind of most known ones here. And it actually kind of goes in a cycle as well. But it first starts out with that adult learners are different from students in that they need to know why they are learning. I always tell people, one of my phrases is, teaching's not a secret. I don't sit there and hold back why I do something to my students. I literally am like, we're doing this activity because X, Y, and Z. It doesn't matter for me what the population or age is, but for individuals who are adults, it is really usually critical or a very important thing for them to really get why they are doing it. So when students go, why are we learning it? It's not always them being disrespectful for adults, given that they have a lifelong learning in their life. You know, they've been learning their entire life. They need context of why this particular thing matters.
And it's not about the grade. And it's not about because you said so.
Yep.
Well, and I think that applies to adults. It also applies to really to any age and fits right into universal design for learning that we're going to be talking about next week, where the why of learning is one of the 3 foundations.
Right.
Yep. And like I said, and for this, I'm just covering Knowles specifically, but yes, that I would say that this concept does translate across all populations. Self-concept, where adults are independent and self-directing. This also is, being aware of, we're at the cusp of individuals who still are doing some, if you have students in your classes that are in their 20s, their brains are still forming. We do know that, frontal cortex development, some of this doesn't cement until 2027, that range of time. So some of that piece is that there are things that are happening adults developmentally that are not happening with children, but there are some things around independence and self-directing that there's a good area here. Experience, where at this point, the longer you're on the planet, the longer you have experience, the more you can pull from, and to acknowledge that. A lot of times you'll hear in classrooms, the kids are doing this. Well, a lot of times I would say to people, you might have students who are your age or older, and just the active experience, you want your experience to matter, they want theirs too as well. Readiness to learn. A lot of our students, as we know, are not coming to school just for the sake of learning. They are coming for ability to keep a job, be promoted in a job, change careers, stabilize their home life for a variety of reasons. So a lot of times they're trying to integrate it into their everyday life. Conversations about family or bringing into things about how hard they're struggling with that is far more common than say you would a child or an adolescent who may not have that worry. Orientation to learning is that adults in general are more focused on problem centered approaches than subject centered approaches. Now, this is also, a lot of times young children aren't always aware of their own learning. We don't have conversations about how they learn. But a lot of times you'll hear people wanting you to get to the point. And that is just usually based on a myriad of factors that they're kind of they think that there's a solution to something. So how you construct your, lessons and things like that is understanding that they want to see a problem and solution. Because in their daily life, they're asked a lot of times, as a mom, as a family member, your kids don't really want to know the
Why?
Yeah. Yeah. Motivation, a lot of times internal versus external motivation. A lot of times adult learners, specifically around theory, around family issues, things like that, they are internally motivated for those other reasons, as I said before, like readiness to learn. So the whole androgy thing of Knowles was just to acknowledge that by age, because we also get into talking about later life adult learning theory of when older individuals come back in, we're also talking about cognition and that there's pieces in here that are different than you see. So when you look at a learning theory, to be aware that some of them are also thinking about age and cognition, whether it's adults or children. So when you're looking at a theory, just to be aware that there are individuals who are incorporating the cognition of adults and the state of the brain as adults versus children. That all makes sense? All right. Okay.
As I say, I know from experience that especially some people who are back for retraining, when you tell them about the practical use or say, this is where I've seen this is actually relevant, a lot of people respond really well to that, and just seeing that there is a practical use. There is a reason we're showing you this, and they tend to, like I said, especially the people who are like back for retraining and are a little bit older, tend to respond really well to that.
In talking to my students, I've heard a common thing of, I don't like that I have discussions for the sake of discussion. And to me, I sit there and go, well, I craft my discussions very intentionally that the conversation should be steered in a certain direction. But I realize I may need to say that to my students, being like, you might not get it, but in 3 weeks, when we've built on something, you might get why we had that conversation. And sometimes like I said, teaching is not a secret. This one I'm going to go through really quickly. As an instructional designer, a lot of times we also have a subsect of models that are given to us of how we actually create content. How do you develop learning materials? How do you develop a lesson versus a video versus any type of what we call deliverables? You'll hear that a lot from instructional designers, deliverables or markups or things like that. It's actually that we're asked to create a particular piece of content or an entire class, and we need to actually have a structure of how we go about doing that. ADDIE, and it's also has several other letters after it now by other theorists, basically is analyze, design, develop, implement, and evaluate. And this is just basically, initially it kind of goes in a cycle, but it doesn't have to. It can go backwards and forwards and move around.
Probably sounds very familiar to making widgets.
Yeah. So it's basically, especially if for, Steve with doing a course map, for when you're doing a course map, or if you've seen the course maps of the classes, what you're doing is you get a structure and then you have to kind of figure out what are your goals, what is needing to be taught. You come up with the thinking things. Then what you need to do is actually put those thoughts, what are the topics, what are the objectives, all of that into some type of structure. Then you have to develop the very learning assets, the discussions, the assignments, the video content, the activities, come up with the instructions, all of that. Then you actually have the act of delivering it. And I would say in between development and implementation, there's also a testing. You should really be testing your stuff not on your students, but with other people or other colleagues, other subject matter experts. But implementation is that if you're in the actual, in the classroom, you're putting the activity on, you're actually putting it out into the world. You can't change anything at this point. You're just kind of putting it out there to see how it gets received. And then the evaluation is for you to be able to review the process and then determine correction as needed to then come back around and do it again. And so this just gives us a structure that if you're working on a team and you have a graphic designer, you have a subject matter expert, an instructional designer, a dean, whatever, that they all know what their role is in what part. So I would say a dean would not necessarily be in the development stage, but they might very much be in the analyze design phase, whereas the designers would be through the whole thing. Students, faculty, other people on campus might be part of the evaluation if we were looking at like course design as an entire campus thing. So that's kind of just an example. So just to let you know, I also thought that this would be really good for you all in terms of it is a very structured way of thinking of it. And we kind of call that like modeled structures. Let's see, next one. This is another one I think would be really interesting. Also, I'm not going to cover too much. What I did want to say is that Nick Massa, who is one of the faculties, he's photonics, correct? Am I in that?
Yeah.
He is actually a big proponent of problem-based learning. My master's program at UMass was actually a big proponent of problem-based learning. And the basic gist of it, and I liked it that there was a comparison here, that traditional learning comes to told what we need to know, memorize it, and then problem assigned to illustrate how to use it. In problem-based learning, you come up with the problem first. And then as a collective, because it's a very group-oriented process, the students learn to identify what they need to know, and then they come up with the solution. So in some ways, it's a little bit of what we call backwards design. But what it does is it gives you the problem first, and then what you do is you can help organize and structure how the students can learn this. An example that I know that they do in like K through 12 is like weather forecasting. So the question is how is the weather determined? And then the teacher sets up different things to talk about meteorology and talk about weather patterns and talk about different things. And then the students do scientific little projects and things like that. They do their readings, all of that, to then be able to do presentations. So it really kind of turns the whole thing again around being teacher-centered to being more student, and it's a very group-oriented process. And I would say that Nick has a lot of resources on this. So also that would be, I kind of like the way that when he talks about it to kind of bring that up. So problem-based learning. The next one is going to be, let me make sure I click on the actual mouse. Multiple intelligence theory. And again, we talked about this really briefly in week 2 with Gardner. And in this case, this particular image has 8 of them. In the past, someone has mentioned to me that there is 9. Now, the multiple intelligence theory has a lot of critics to it. And the main reason why is that it was not a traditionally researched topic. So I would say that there's not a lot of empirical data. That was one of the biggest critiques of Gardner. So a lot of times multiple intelligence theory really kind of goes to the wayside of an actual theory and more as a practice or kind of being exposed like a foundation of who may be in your classroom. So I think the last time we talked about multiple intelligence theory, it was just to really realize that you have different potential ways of presenting materials in your classroom, and your learners might gravitate to one of these areas more than another, but that no one really is one or the other. So we all have components of this, but given whether it's learning preference, they've been encouraged to do that, or just simply that it's one of more comfort, these might be the learning styles or intelligences that people gravitate to. I would say that if you're, we usually trades workers, individuals like that, we're not encouraged to be logical, mathematical, taking tests, the path at which people go on. Similar with artists. Artists are usually geared more to doing linguistic spatial than they are other things. We sometimes see a strength in a student and we gravitate them towards that. And then they think that's the way that they learn. So I like to just bring that up, but also that Gardner does have a lot of detractors. And so I like to put that little piece in there because you hear this a lot. But remember that this isn't really a theory. It's more of looking at your student population and seeing the different ways that they could potentially learn.
Plug the 10:28, so we only
Mhm.
got another minute.
Yep.
I need a few minutes to prep for class today.
Mhm.
And my class is at 10:40.
Yep.
So I might have to about
Yep.
go over. That's all.
So those were that was the primer of all of the theories. And I think the one thing that wanted to bring up was I switched my screen and not this one. How familiar are you with learning theories, pedagogical frameworks that we've, presented? And how might you use them and what do you want to know more about?
I can say that learning, I am familiar with them because I have a couple of them that I have been able to recognize that I work with. So if you go back, definitely the musical one. And so bodily, kinesthetic, musical, and spatial. Those three. Oh, and interpersonal. Those four are like my main four ones. I was actually talking to Tom yesterday. We were talking about music and he was like, it's very easy for some people to get like the rhythm of the songs. And I'm like, yeah, it only takes me like 3 times to listen to a song and I have my brain already like in the back brain. I already memorized a song because that's something I have been able to do my whole entire life. And bodily kinesthetic, I used to be a dancer when I was little, so it was very easy for me to get like I said, like the rhythm and stuff. But definitely the linguistic one and the intrapersonal. Those are two ones I'd be interested to look a little bit more into, definitely.
Kyle, so the way that this graphic is presented, where it's kind of each theory, each intelligence is a triangle, but then they're kind of grouped into squares or rectangles.
Mhm.
As Lanisha was talking about the dance and the music, so those two being comfortable with dance kind of goes hand in hand with the musical understanding. So it seems like they're grouped intentionally, like they're not paired at random.
Yeah. Oh, I didn't see it that way. So interesting point. Yeah.
Well, and I also think about when we talk about like bodily kinesthetic, I think about like here, individuals using machines. I would say that probably students who want to actually be more physical, that their learning actually comes from touch. So I think that's a good point to it. Like I said, I just wanted a graphic that kind of displayed all of this. But for me is like one of the things I really like to point out is that the goal is to see how we can maybe balance out that American education, it has been predominantly for that first 80 years, logical, mathematical. We didn't take interpersonal, intrapersonal linguistics. And again, this is not a theory. This is not saying that everyone is this. It is just that we may be encouraged to gravitate towards one way, and that being aware that when we sometimes also struggle when we work with people, it might be that the way that they're taking information in is just different than us.
I have a question in relation to this. Will this be in any way related or similar to what is called a DISC assessment? I don't know if you have heard.
I
about that.
DISC?
Yes.
I'm not sure.
It's about like personal.
What, can you say that term again?
DI,
It's DICS.
I feel like I have heard it.
Oh, sorry, backwards. DISC assessment.
And also that like this particular theory is more in that, I think when I mentioned learning styles, that learning styles themselves have also come under fire a lot because no one does particularly learn one way. And so it really is, and this is kind of the great thing about all of these things is we get exposed to these things and we ourselves as teachers become critical thinkers about what we're going to use and what we're going to not. I like that this gives me a name to things when I think about, I'd like my students to move in the classroom more. And that's because I think some students benefit from movement versus sitting in the classroom.
Yeah.
But I don't sit there and say, every student here needs to have a checkoff of a bodily, I want to say,
Yeah.
bodily kinesthetic
Mhm.
experience today, understanding living things, that kind of thing as well.
You can also use one to help the other. Like I never thought of myself as being that good in language, so
Mhm.
linguistic. But I had a Chinese teacher who would walk and move around when we were studying. So now
You
that
have that
body movement,
relation.
because I was,
Mm.
yeah. So that muscle memory helped me remember many
Yes.
terms and words. And you might want to consider that with your students because
Yeah.
they can probably come up to a machine and go like this. They're just like
Yeah.
dialing a phone or a phone number,
Mhm.
whereas they might not be able to tell you
Yeah.
or write it.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I know that over in health sciences, the phrase muscle memory
Mm.
is that, a part of this is that, when you're using something, you get accustomed to it. You don't necessarily even think about it.
That's why labs are so important in this, in MET.
Yeah,
And we can't do it online
right.
because of muscle memory. There's just no way of doing it online.
You could do it maybe in a VR situation, but then you'd still want to practice.
You
it
still
with
gotta be in
this
front of that
count,
machine,
that
you gotta
touch.
know, yeah, you
Mhm.
gotta see what's happening.
Mhm.
And there's no way to duplicate that.
Cosmetology was the same.
Yep.
When they talked about you have to feel the hair
Yep.
in
Mhm.
order to know how it's going to move.
Yep.
Mhm.
Or what's gonna happen in the texture.
Right.
Mhm.
And I think that also is, for me, it's one of these things of a lot of times the technical, like we have this conversation here about technical versus technology,
Yeah.
but I also want to be respectful of what the technical word based itself in was, that it was about something outside of the traditional classroom experience that we do learn in all sorts of environments. And, there's chemistry in the hair, like in cosmetology. There's a lot of science in it. You can hurt someone in cosmetology.
Yep.
You equally, I think I've had that example before when I was, I'm blanking out who I was talking to, but where I was like looking at the spreadsheet that was being taught. And I said, wait, if the student is off by how many things, and this widget gets put in a car, that could be a car that has 100,000 defects. I was like, yes. And that's how important it is. That's math. I think a lot of times people think you all work with machines, but you're doing science and math, and it's technical, but it's,
We're doing
That's it, you're doing
everything,
yes.
Everything, yes.
Yeah.
science, technology, engineering, math, and art.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
we're
yeah,
full steam
definitely.
here.
Yeah.
I would agree with that.
We're full
And you're a
steam.
naturalist because you do a lot of recycling of chemicals and
I was
things.
gonna say,
Oh,
I
yeah,
know,
basically,
I
yeah.
understand everything except for interpersonal and linguistics. Can ask any of my ex-girlfriends about those guys. That's the tough one. Everything else, yes, I agree with. The two tough ones up there is the interpersonal and linguistics.
You might want to consider bolstering the ones you feel could have a challenge with something you feel like you're more strong at. Like I did with body kinesthetics with linguistics. Just a thought.
Well, and I think one of the intrapersonal skills is being able to understand which of the intelligences you may be weaker in, so that then, as Mary is saying, you can be aware of that and work towards it. It's not that you can't do the other one, it's that it's something that comes with more of a challenge, and so may require more time to achieve.
And then also think if you had an injury where you couldn't use your legs, your bodily movement would be impaired. So, you might be able to do something on a different
Yeah, it's the
side.
same way how, blind people or deaf
Yep.
people, like their different senses are still activated. They
Exactly.
hyphen up to compensate for the rest, for the
Right.
one that is not working.
Right.
Yeah, but this is very interesting. It's kind of similar to the DISC assessment, which is dominance, influence, steadiness, and conscientiousness. It's more like meant for like people like that are working on teams to kind of
Mm.
like see what
Mhm.
type of personality they are, and they do an assessment and stuff like that. It's actually pretty fun. Yeah, to figure out what they are, so that way when you do, like you were saying, like just because you're communicating with them, maybe they're receiving it the wrong way
Exactly.
because it's not the way that they, process
Oh,
things.
business has all that
Mhm.
tied up in all kinds of.
Yeah.
Mhm. And you got advising coming up soon.
Yeah.
Well, we're new, so we
No,
don't
I
know
haven't-
if.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
right. Well,
I haven't been assigned anybody.
Yeah.
No, me neither.
you get till next spring.
However,
Well, I kind of do that like low key already with some of the students.
I'm sure
so,
you do.
Yeah.
There's always that hidden advising.
we actually
Mhm.
should, mention, take 5 minutes, 10 minutes in all our classes
Yeah.
and talk about advising in general.
Mhm.
Yes,
Mhm.
yes.
I think John used to spend way too much time on it, but just mention that. And this is actually you guys got to figure this out.
Yeah.
We can advise, but you still make that
Right.
decision. And if we come up with some kind of narrative that we can actually say at the beginning of all of our classes leading up to advising, and that may actually even help. Instead of the students just coming in blind going, I don't know what I want to do,
Yeah.
come up with a narrative, something that says, hey, let's read this out to the class and let's all be on the same page.
Yeah, that's great.
I'm also gonna stop the share on the recording.
Okay.
And what I was also gonna